Welcome to Chosen by Love, where fate brings hearts together in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and join our growing family of story lovers. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's begin today's journey. If someone handed you unlimited money for just one day, would your heart become visible before your shopping cart did? The question lingered in the air long before anyone knew it was more than a thought. On the top floor of Mercer Global Tower overlooking downtown Chicago, Callan Mercer stood silently behind a wall of glass, as the morning sun reflected across miles of steel and concrete. At 34, he had built one of America's fastest-growing technology companies, yet the achievement no longer impressed him. Every charity gala sounded the same. Every award celebrated generosity measured by dollar signs instead of character. Every executive interview polished the right answers until sincerity became impossible to recognize. That was why today's experiment had nothing to do with resumes, social status, or impressive degrees. It was about discovering what people revealed when no one appeared to be watching. On a sleek conference table rested 4 matte black envelopes. Inside each one waited a premium black credit card with no spending limit, no expiration, and no visible owner. Only Callan and his longtime legal advisor, Evelyn Rhodes, knew they were linked directly to a private account created exclusively for this test. "Everything is ready," Evelyn said quietly as she handed him a tablet displaying 4 simple profiles. "None of them knows who organized this." Callan nodded without taking his eyes off the city below. "Good. Today isn't about finding someone who knows how to spend money. It's about finding someone who understands what money is actually for." Minutes later, 4 women were escorted into an elegant meeting room decorated with fresh white orchids, warm lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows. They exchanged polite smiles, each trying to guess why complete strangers had been invited to the same mysterious interview. One wore designer heels. Another carried herself like someone accustomed to luxury. The third confidently introduced herself before anyone asked. The fourth quietly chose the chair nearest the window and folded her hands in her lap. Her name was Maren Whitlock. She wore a simple navy sweater, comfortable flats, and a silver watch with tiny scratches around the edge. She barely spoke above a whisper, yet her calm presence somehow stood apart from the louder personalities surrounding her. A woman in a tailored gray suit entered carrying a polished wooden box. "Good morning," she began warmly. "You have each been selected for a confidential leadership evaluation sponsored by a private foundation. There will be only one instruction." She opened the box and carefully placed 1 black card in front of each participant. The room instantly fell silent. "For the next 24 hours, you may use this card however you wish. There is no spending limit. You may purchase anything that is legal. Tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, you will return here and explain every purchase you made." One of the women laughed nervously. "There has to be a catch." "There isn't," the woman replied with a pleasant smile. "No receipts are required. No categories are prohibited. No one will contact you during the test. Simply spend as you believe is right." Excitement spread across 3 faces almost immediately. Vacation ideas, designer boutiques, luxury cars, exclusive jewelry stores, and dream shopping lists filled the conversation before the cards had even been picked up. Maren remained completely silent. She lifted the card carefully as if it belonged to someone else and studied its smooth black surface without smiling. Across the building, hidden behind a discreet observation room, Callan watched every expression through live security monitors. He wasn't interested in hearing what people claimed they valued. He wanted to witness the first instinct that appeared when unlimited opportunity landed quietly in their hands. One by one, the women signed temporary usage agreements and walked toward the elevators, each carrying the same black card but leaving with entirely different dreams. Maren stepped out last. Before the elevator doors closed, she looked down once more at the card resting in her palm, took a slow breath, and slipped it into her worn leather wallet beside a faded photograph that no camera could clearly capture. Callan noticed that single quiet gesture and leaned slightly closer to the screen. For reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself wondering not what she would buy first, but who she would think about before buying anything at all. The moment the elevators reached the lobby, the 4 women drifted in different directions, each carrying the exact same black card but guided by completely different desires. Hidden inside Mercer Global's private operations center, Callan Mercer watched 4 live location feeds appear across a digital map of Chicago. He folded his arms as the first notifications quietly arrived. Woman number 1 entered a luxury boutique along the Magnificent Mile before she had even walked 3 city blocks. Within 15 minutes she had purchased 2 designer handbags, a diamond bracelet, and a pair of custom leather boots. The total climbed higher with every receipt. She smiled brightly into her phone while sending photos to her friends, laughing as if she had won the lottery. The second participant chose a luxury dealership. She spent nearly an hour test driving imported sports cars before placing a deposit on one she admitted she had dreamed about for years. She told the salesman that life was too short to hesitate when opportunity appeared. The third woman headed straight toward an upscale shopping district filled with exclusive cosmetics, expensive clothing, and high-end furniture. She hired a personal stylist before noon and reserved a weekend at an exclusive spa resort, without asking a single question about the balance remaining on the card. Callan observed every purchase without expression. Nothing surprised him. Money simply magnified priorities that already existed. Then his attention shifted to the fourth screen. Maren Whitlock never entered a luxury store. Instead, she parked beside a neighborhood grocery store nearly 30 minutes west of downtown. She walked slowly through each aisle with a small shopping cart, comparing prices instead of reaching for premium brands. Fresh vegetables, whole grain, bread, eggs, milk, canned soup, rice, oatmeal, chicken, apples, bananas. Nothing unnecessary, nothing extravagant. She paused near the coffee aisle for several seconds before quietly placing a modest bag of ground coffee into the cart. When she reached the register, she smiled politely at the elderly cashier, thanked her by name after reading her badge, and carefully packed every grocery bag herself. Callan frowned slightly. This was not what he expected from someone given unlimited spending power. But the real surprise came 10 minutes later. Maren drove only 6 blocks before stopping outside a small brick apartment building. She carried every grocery bag upstairs and knocked gently on apartment 3B. An elderly man opened the door using a walker. His face immediately brightened. "Maren," he said with obvious relief, "you did not have to do this again." She smiled softly. "You forgot to buy groceries because you were stretching your medication until Friday, Mr. Donnelly. That is not a good plan." The old man lowered his eyes, embarrassed. "I was trying to make everything last." "Now you do not have to," she answered, carefully placing food inside his tiny kitchen. Before leaving, she quietly replaced the nearly empty coffee container without mentioning it. She accepted nothing in return except a grateful smile. Back inside Mercer Global, Callan leaned closer to the monitor. Evelyn noticed the change in his posture. "Interesting," she asked. "Very," he admitted. "But one generous delivery does not explain everything." The afternoon continued. Maren stopped at a neighborhood pharmacy. She paid for prescriptions that had been waiting for pickup under another customer's name before quietly asking the pharmacist not to mention who had covered the cost. Then she crossed the street to a bookstore where she purchased several textbooks, notebooks, and scientific calculators. Instead of taking them home, she delivered everything to a local community center preparing students for college entrance exams. Every transaction generated another notification on Callan's screen. Every destination raised another question. She was spending thousands of dollars, yet nothing entered. Her own apartment. Nothing benefited her personally. Late that afternoon, Maren finally sat alone on a quiet park bench overlooking Lake Michigan. She opened her worn leather wallet and removed the small faded photograph Callan had noticed earlier. It showed a smiling older woman with one hand resting gently on a young girl's shoulder. Maren looked at the picture for several silent moments before slipping it back into its place beside the black card. Then she reached into her canvas tote and pulled out a small spiral notebook. One line at a time, she carefully recorded every purchase, every dollar, every destination, and every reason. She even wrote the names of every person she had helped. When she finished, she closed the notebook, held it against her chest for just a second, and whispered something too soft for any microphone to capture. Watching from miles away, Callan realized he had spent years studying business reports worth billions of dollars. Yet somehow the most valuable document he had ever seen was a simple notebook filled with careful handwriting from a woman who still had not purchased a single thing for herself. Evening settled over Chicago beneath a sky painted in deep shades of blue and gold, but Marin Whitlock's day was far from over. While the other 3 participants were finishing elegant dinners, posting carefully framed photographs, or arranging luxury deliveries to their homes, Marin drove toward the west side of the city where the bright lights slowly gave way to older neighborhoods filled with small churches, family-owned stores, and apartment buildings that had weathered decades of changing seasons. Inside Mercer Global's private observation room, Callan Mercer expected her to finally spend something on herself. Instead, another transaction appeared. A local medical supply store. He watched the security footage as Marin quietly purchased a folding wheelchair, a pair of orthopedic shoes, and several weeks of physical therapy equipment. She loaded everything into the back of her compact sedan before driving another 20 minutes to a modest duplex. A woman in her early 30s opened the front door carrying a toddler on one hip while trying to comfort another little girl standing beside her. The moment she saw Marin, her tired expression softened into genuine relief. "You should not have come after everything you already do," the woman said. Marin smiled and gently embraced her. "You are family, Claire. Family is never an interruption." Together they carried the equipment inside. Callan noticed that Marin never mentioned the black card or the experiment. She simply listened while Claire spoke about balancing work, caring for her father after a stroke, and raising 2 children without complaining. Marin quietly assembled the wheelchair herself, adjusted its height, and carefully read through every instruction booklet before placing them in a neat folder beside Claire's kitchen calendar. Before leaving, she slipped an envelope beneath a fruit bowl where nobody appeared to notice. Evelyn enlarged the camera image after Marin drove away. Inside the envelope was a receipt showing that 6 months of physical therapy sessions had already been paid in full. "She keeps hiding every good thing she does," Evelyn whispered. Callan remained silent. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. As darkness settled over the city, Marin stopped at a 24-hour diner instead of an expensive restaurant. She ordered only a bowl of vegetable soup and a glass of water. While waiting, she noticed a young college student at the next booth quietly counting coins before apologizing to the waitress and removing an item from his order. Marin never interrupted. When she finished eating, she paid her own modest bill and asked the waitress to add the student's meal to the same receipt without revealing who had covered it. She left before the food even reached his table. The young man looked around in confusion after learning someone had paid for his dinner, but the kind stranger was already gone. Back in his office, Callan found himself replaying the footage instead of watching the live feed. There was no audience for these moments. No cameras that Marin knew about. No social media posts. No expectation of praise. Every generous act disappeared as quietly as it had appeared. "Run a background report," he finally told Evelyn. "Not finances. Not employment history. I want community records, volunteer organizations, neighborhood references. Everything that explains why she behaves like this." Less than an hour later, the first results arrived. There were no awards. No newspaper articles. No viral stories. Instead, there were dozens of ordinary people who described Marin almost the same way. The woman who always remembered birthdays at the senior center. The neighbor who drove people to medical appointments without charging for gas. The volunteer who never signed her full name on donation forms. The employee who quietly left grocery gift cards in coworkers' mailboxes every Thanksgiving. Callan slowly leaned back in his chair. Billion-dollar acquisitions had taught him to search for hidden value beneath the surface. Somehow he had almost overlooked the rarest investment of all, a person whose kindness remained exactly the same whether anyone noticed or not. Near midnight, the final notification of the day appeared. Marin returned to her small apartment carrying nothing except her spiral notebook and the nearly untouched black card. She sat beside the window overlooking the quiet street below, opened the notebook once more, and carefully reviewed every purchase line by line. After checking each amount against the digital receipts stored on her phone, she wrote one final sentence beneath the list. "Every dollar should leave someone's tomorrow better than their yesterday." She closed the notebook, placed it beside the faded photograph in her wallet, turned off the light, and prepared for the interview waiting the next morning, completely unaware that a man who had spent years measuring success in quarterly earnings had just discovered a definition of wealth that no balance sheet had ever been able to capture. The next morning arrived with crisp autumn air drifting between the glass towers of downtown Chicago. By 8:30, Mercer Global Tower was already alive with quiet conversations, polished shoes crossing marble floors, and elevators carrying executives toward another busy day. Yet inside the private observation suite on the top floor, only two people remained focused on a very different agenda. Callan Mercer stood beside the wall of monitors with a cup of untouched black coffee cooling in his hand while Evelyn Rhodes reviewed the complete spending reports from the previous 24 hours. Every purchase had now been organized into detailed summaries. Luxury handbags, fine jewelry, resort reservations, vehicle deposits, premium cosmetics, designer clothing. Then came Maren Whitlock's report. Grocery deliveries, prescription payments, medical equipment, educational supplies, community assistance. Every receipt matched the careful handwritten notes in her small spiral notebook. Not a single purchase benefited her personally. Callan studied the report in silence. "Is there anything unusual in the financial records?" he finally asked. Evelyn slowly shook her head. Nothing except the obvious. She spent nearly the same amount as the others, but every dollar went toward someone else's future. Callan looked again at one particular receipt from the bookstore. Did she know those students? No, Evelyn answered. We confirmed that this morning. She simply overheard a volunteer explaining they were short on supplies for their college preparation program. Callan exhaled slowly. Throughout his career he had learned that impressive presentations often concealed disappointing reality. Investors exaggerated confidence. Executives polished every sentence. Applicants memorized answers they believed powerful people wanted to hear. But kindness performed in complete privacy could not be rehearsed. It either existed or it did not. He replayed another security recording from the previous evening. Maren quietly leaving the diner after anonymously paying for a stranger's dinner. No hesitation. No expectation of gratitude. No audience. He paused the video on the brief moment she smiled at the waitress before walking away. It was not a dramatic smile. It was peaceful. The kind of expression that came from someone who believed doing the right thing was simply part of an ordinary day. She behaves the same way whether she has $10 or unlimited resources, Callan murmured. Evelyn looked toward him with quiet curiosity. You sound surprised. He gave a faint smile. I am. Most people believe wealth changes character. In reality, it usually reveals it. Evelyn closed the report folder. Then perhaps your experiment has already answered the question you designed it to ask. Callan remained thoughtful for several moments before walking toward the large window overlooking Lake Michigan. As a child, his grandfather had often repeated one lesson that never fully made sense until now. Money is a spotlight. It does not create the person standing beneath it. It only makes that person easier to see. For years Callan had believed the saying was too simple. After building a multi-billion-dollar company, he assumed human nature had become far more complicated. Yet one quiet woman carrying a worn leather wallet had challenged that belief in less than a day. His phone vibrated softly. It was a reminder that the participants would begin arriving in less than 30 minutes. The final interviews were about to begin. Across the city, Maren left her apartment wearing the same navy sweater she had worn the day before. She carried no designer shopping bags, no expensive accessories, and no visible sign that she had briefly held unlimited purchasing power. Before getting into her car, she opened her wallet one more time. The faded photograph remained tucked beside the black card. She smiled gently at the familiar face in the picture and whispered, I hope I made you proud. Then she carefully placed the spiral notebook into her canvas tote and drove toward Mercer Global Tower without the slightest idea that every quiet choice she had made over the previous 24 hours had already transformed the opinion of a man who rarely admired anyone. By 9 o'clock, the reception area outside the executive conference room began filling once again. The other three women arrived dressed in newly purchased outfits, excitedly discussing their experiences and wondering which answer might impress the mysterious foundation the most. Maren greeted each of them politely before taking the same chair near the window where she had quietly sat the previous morning. She rested her canvas tote beside her feet and folded her hands in her lap. Exactly as before. Behind the mirrored observation glass, Callan watched her take her seat and noticed something that made him pause. Unlike everyone else in the room, she did not seem nervous about whether she would be chosen. She simply looked grateful for the opportunity to have participated at all. For the first time since creating the experiment, Callan realized the final interview was no longer about testing Marin Whitlock. It was about testing whether he possessed the wisdom to recognize the kind of person his own success had been searching for all along. The executive conference room felt unusually quiet as the final interviews officially began. One by one, the 4 participants were invited to present how they had used the unlimited black card during the previous 24 hours. The first woman stood confidently, smiling as assistants displayed photographs of designer handbags, diamond jewelry, and luxury accessories across the large presentation screen. She spoke enthusiastically about rewarding herself after years of hard work, insisting that confidence was an investment. Several executives nodded politely while taking notes. The second participant described placing a deposit on an imported sports car and reserving an exclusive vacation. She explained that opportunities like these rarely appeared twice and believed success should be celebrated without hesitation. The third woman proudly shared images of expensive fashion, premium cosmetics, and a luxury spa retreat. She laughed lightly as she admitted she had always dreamed about living like a celebrity, and for one unforgettable day she finally had the chance. Their presentations were polished, confident, and carefully prepared. Every purchase reflected personal ambition, comfort, or prestige. When the moderator quietly announced, "Marin Whitlock," every conversation stopped. Marin slowly rose from her chair, carrying only her worn canvas tote. Unlike the others, she had no shopping bags, no glossy presentation, and no photographs waiting on the screen. She walked toward the conference table with calm, measured steps and carefully placed 2 simple items in front of the interview panel. The first was her small spiral notebook with its worn edges and handwritten pages. The second was a neatly organized stack of receipts secured with an ordinary paper clip. Although receipts had never been required, she had carefully organized every single one. She folded her hands together and offered an apologetic smile. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I could not spend it on myself." For several long seconds nobody spoke. One executive quietly reached for the notebook while another carefully sorted through the receipts. Grocery purchases, prescription payments, medical equipment, educational supplies, rent assistance, community donations. Every receipt matched a handwritten entry explaining where the money had gone and why. There was not a single purchase for clothing, jewelry, electronics, vacations, or personal entertainment. One woman sitting across the table frowned in disbelief. "You are telling us that you were given unlimited spending power and bought absolutely nothing for yourself?" Marin nodded gently. "Nothing that I needed more than someone else." The room became even quieter. The moderator looked toward the observation glass, unaware that behind it Callan Mercer had already stepped away from the monitors. He no longer wanted to watch through a screen. He wanted to hear her answers with his own ears. Moments later, the conference room door opened. Callan entered without introducing himself, dressed in the same tailored navy suit he had worn throughout the experiment. To everyone else, he appeared to be another senior executive joining the evaluation. Marin looked up politely, offering a small respectful smile before lowering her eyes again. She had no idea she was looking at the man who had followed every decision she made during the previous day. Callan walked slowly toward the table and picked up the spiral notebook. He turned each page carefully, studying the neat handwriting, the precise calculations, and the small notes written beside every expense. Every dollar had a purpose. Every receipt told the story of someone whose burden had been made a little lighter. He closed the notebook gently instead of placing it back on the table. Looking directly at Marin, his voice remained calm, but the question carried a weight that silenced everyone in the room. "Why?" The question lingered in the conference room long after Callan Mercer spoke it. No one reached for another document. No one whispered another opinion. Every pair of eyes rested quietly on Marin Whitlock as she looked down at the spiral notebook still resting in Callan's hands. She took a slow breath before answering. "Because I have already lived on the other side of that table," she said softly. The room remained silent. "When I was 8 years old, my mother lost her job. We did everything we could to keep our apartment, but every month became a little harder than the one before. Some nights we pretended we were not hungry because we wanted the other person to eat first. Her voice never trembled, yet every word carried the quiet weight of memory. One winter afternoon someone knocked on our door. There were groceries outside. Milk, bread, soup, fresh fruit, warm blankets, and an envelope with enough money to cover our rent for 2 months. There was no name, no return address, no explanation. She smiled faintly at the memory. My mother cried harder that day than I had ever seen before. Not because we were poor, but because someone had seen us without asking for anything in return. Callan listened without moving. Maren continued, her eyes fixed on the notebook rather than the people around her. 4 years we never discovered who that person was. My mother always believed that some blessings are not meant to introduce themselves. She told me something I have never forgotten. She said that if life ever became kinder to us, we should become that anonymous knock on someone else's door. Several executives quietly lowered their eyes. Even the 3 women who had proudly presented luxury purchases only minutes earlier now listened without interrupting. Things slowly became better, Maren said. I worked after school. I earned scholarships. I found people who encouraged me when they did not have to. Every opportunity one received came because someone believed I was worth helping. So I made myself a promise. She looked up for the first time, meeting Callan's eyes with calm honesty. If I ever had more than I needed, even for one day, I would spend that day becoming the person who once saved my family. The words settled over the room like a quiet echo. Callan slowly opened the notebook again. Between neat rows of numbers, he noticed small handwritten notes beside nearly every purchase. Mr. Donnelly smiled today. Claire can focus on her children now. Future nurse. Future engineer. Future teacher. None of the entries mentioned money. Every line mentioned people. You recorded their names, Callan observed quietly. Maren nodded. Money disappears. People should not. He turned another page and found the final sentence she had written the night before. Every dollar should leave someone's tomorrow better than their yesterday. Callan read it twice before gently closing the notebook. Throughout his career he had negotiated billion-dollar agreements, acquired international companies, and built an empire that appeared on magazine covers around the world. Yet standing before him was a woman who measured success with entirely different numbers. Not profit margins. Not stock prices. Not market share. She counted relieved families, hopeful students, and peaceful nights made possible because someone had quietly cared. For the first time in many years, Callan realized that the experiment had stopped being about choosing the right candidate. It had become a lesson he never expected to receive himself. He looked around the room, noticing that every executive remained silent, not because they were waiting for another answer, but because none of them could think of a better one. Returning his attention to Maren, Callan offered a slow, respectful nod. The admiration in his eyes was impossible to hide now. Without saying another word, he walked toward the presentation stage at the front of the room. His hand rested lightly on the remote control beside the large display screen. The next truth was no longer meant to stay hidden. Callan Mercer stood quietly at the front of the conference room with the small remote resting in his hand. No one spoke. The silence itself seemed to carry more weight than any presentation that had taken place that morning. Maren remained seated, watching him with quiet curiosity, still believing he was simply another executive invited to evaluate the candidates. Callan took one slow breath before pressing a single button. The enormous display behind him faded to black for only a moment before the Mercer Global logo illuminated the entire room. Several executives immediately straightened in their chairs. Evelyn Rhodes rose from her seat without saying a word. Then another image appeared. It was a photograph of Callan standing beside world leaders during an international technology summit. Another slide followed, showing magazine covers featuring his face beneath headlines celebrating Mercer Global's record-breaking growth. Then came photographs from charitable foundations, university commencements, and global business conferences. Confused whispers spread across the room. The 3 women exchanged puzzled glances before one of them quietly gasped. "That is him." Another leaned forward, staring at the screen in disbelief. "He owns Mercer Global." Maren looked from the photographs back to Callan. Her eyes widened slightly, not with excitement but with genuine surprise. She had spent the last several minutes speaking openly to the very person who had organized the entire experiment. Callan slowly stepped away from the screen and faced everyone in the room. His voice remained calm and measured. "My name is Callan Mercer. I founded Mercer Global 12 years ago." The room immediately fell silent again. Even those who had already recognized him seemed unsure what would happen next. Callan continued, "None of you were invited here for a job interview." Three faces instantly lost their confident smiles. "You were never being evaluated for a corporate position." He allowed another brief pause before continuing. "You were participating in an experiment I designed nearly a year ago, after I realized something important. Our company had become exceptionally good at measuring intelligence, experience, and ambition, but we had almost forgotten how to recognize character." He looked toward the presentation screen again. New images appeared, showing anonymous footage from grocery stores, pharmacies, bookstores, and community centers visited during the previous 24 hours. Carefully edited clips demonstrated each participant's choices without embarrassment or judgment. Luxury boutiques, jewelry counters, vacation reservations, sports cars. Then the screen shifted to Marin quietly carrying groceries up a narrow apartment staircase. Another clip showed her delivering school supplies to students. Another captured her leaving the diner after anonymously paying for a stranger's dinner. Finally, the image paused on her carefully writing inside the worn spiral notebook beside the lake. No one moved. No one even looked away. "Money never changes who we are," Callan said softly. "It simply gives us a louder opportunity to show the world who we have always been." His eyes settled on Marin. "Yesterday I believed I was testing for people." A gentle smile appeared for the first time since the experiment had begun. "Instead, one person reminded me why this experiment existed." He walked slowly toward the conference table and placed the spiral notebook back in front of Marin with extraordinary care, almost as though it were something priceless. Mercer Global is establishing a new charitable foundation dedicated to supporting families, education, healthcare, and local communities across the country. This foundation does not need another executive with an impressive resume. It needs someone whose first instinct is to think about others before thinking about themselves. The room seemed to hold its breath. Marin blinked several times, still trying to understand what she was hearing. Callan looked directly into her eyes, his respect unmistakable. "Marin Whitlock, this experiment was never about discovering who could spend the most money. It was about discovering who could be trusted with the responsibility of changing lives." A warm smile slowly spread across Evelyn's face as she watched the realization begin to dawn across the room. For the first time since entering Mercer Global Tower, Marin understood that the greatest gift waiting at the end of the experiment had never been hidden inside the black card. It had been hidden inside the choices she made while carrying it. The conference room remained perfectly still as Callan Mercer's words settled into every corner of the room. Marin Whitlock stood frozen beside the conference table, her hands resting lightly against the worn spiral notebook that had quietly accompanied her through the previous 24 hours. She had never imagined that every ordinary decision she made had been leading to this extraordinary moment. Callan stepped forward carrying a slim black presentation folder. His expression remained composed, but there was a warmth in his eyes that had not existed when the experiment began. "Marin," he said gently, "there are several things I would like to offer you today, but none of them are rewards. They are responsibilities because I believe you have already earned something much more valuable than recognition. You have earned trust. Subject to the final legal documentation, already approved by our board, everything I am about to offer can become effective immediately." Evelyn Rhodes approached with a portfolio and placed it carefully on the conference table. Inside were several neatly organized documents. Callan opened the first page. "Effective immediately, I would like to invite you to become the executive director of the Mercer Community Foundation. The foundation will begin with a permanent endowment dedicated to expanding educational opportunities, neighborhood health programs, emergency housing assistance, and community partnerships across the country. You will not be expected to become someone different. I am asking you to continue being exactly who you already are." Marin looked at the documents in disbelief. Before she could speak, Callan continued. The position includes a salary that reflects the responsibility, complete professional support, and full authority to recommend new community initiatives. He opened another folder. You once spent an entire day helping strangers while returning home to a modest apartment. I believe people who dedicate themselves to serving others should never have to wonder whether they themselves are secure. He gently slid a second document toward her. A condominium overlooking Lincoln Park has been purchased in your name. It is fully paid for. Audible gasps filled the room. Marin instinctively shook her head. That is far too much, she whispered. Callan smiled softly. There is one more item. Evelyn handed him a sealed envelope bearing the crest of a respected business school. Your academic record shows that you postponed graduate school because you believed helping your family mattered more than pursuing your own ambitions. Mercer Global has established a full scholarship covering every expense for an Executive Master of Business Administration program. You may begin whenever you feel ready. Your education will strengthen the work you are already doing. Tears slowly gathered in Marin's eyes, but she still struggled to find words. She had expected nothing more than to return an unfamiliar credit card. Instead, every dream she had quietly set aside for other people was somehow returning to her all at once. Yet Callan had saved the most meaningful surprise for last. Evelyn disappeared briefly before returning carrying a beautifully crafted walnut display case. She carefully placed it on the conference table and lifted the clear glass cover. Inside rested Marin's worn spiral notebook. Every crease, every handwritten page, every carefully folded corner remained exactly as she had left it the previous evening. The only difference was the elegant frame surrounding it. Marin stared at it without blinking. Her hand slowly covered her mouth as tears finally slipped down her cheeks. I do not understand, she whispered. Callan carefully removed the framed notebook and held it with both hands. Yesterday I reviewed financial statements worth billions of dollars, he said quietly. None of them impressed me as much as these handwritten pages. He turned the frame so everyone in the room could see the careful notes beside each receipt, every name she had written, and the final sentence she had recorded before going to sleep. Looking directly into Marin's eyes, he smiled with quiet respect. Most people believe integrity is measured by promises. I believe it is measured by choices. He gently returned the framed notebook to her hands before adding the words that no one in the room would ever forget. Integrity has a receipt. The silence that followed was no longer filled with surprise. It was filled with admiration. Even the three women who had spent the previous day pursuing luxury rose from their seats and began applauding. One by one, the executives joined them until the entire room stood together. Marin looked around in disbelief before lowering her eyes once more to the framed notebook. For the first time since the experiment began, she understood that the smallest object she carried had become the greatest symbol of the life she had always hoped to live, and as she looked back toward Callan, she realized that this remarkable journey was not reaching its conclusion. In many ways it was only just beginning. 1 year passed more quickly than either of them expected. The Mercer Community Foundation had quietly become one of the most respected charitable organizations in Illinois, not because it spent the most money, but because every program began with the same simple question Marin Whitlock asked on her very first day. Who needs us the most today? Under her leadership, thousands of students received scholarships, struggling families found temporary housing, neighborhood health clinics expanded their services, and countless senior citizens discovered they no longer had to face difficult seasons alone. Reporters often asked how the foundation achieved such remarkable results in such a short time. Marin always smiled politely and answered the same way. Good decisions become easier when people matter more than numbers. Those who worked beside her knew those words were not prepared for interviews. She lived by them every single day. Callan Mercer watched the transformation with quiet admiration. Although he remained chairman of the foundation, he rarely stepped into the spotlight. Instead, he visited community centers, schools, and neighborhood programs simply to observe the work Marin had inspired. Every visit reminded him of the lesson she had unknowingly taught him during that extraordinary 24-hour experiment. Success was no longer measured only by quarterly reports or company growth. It was measured by grateful smiles, hopeful conversations, and opportunities created for people who had once believed no one noticed them. Working together became effortless. Their meetings slowly turned into conversations over coffee after community events. Those conversations gradually became evening walks through Lincoln Park after long days filled with volunteer projects. They spoke about books, childhood memories, favorite places in Chicago, and dreams they had quietly postponed while building very different lives. Neither of them rushed the friendship. There were no dramatic declarations or grand gestures. Trust had already been built long before either of them recognized what it was becoming. The employees around them noticed first. Evelyn Rhodes often smiled to herself whenever she watched them discussing new scholarship programs, while completely forgetting the meeting schedule. They challenged one another's ideas with respect, celebrated every small victory together, and never competed for recognition. The foundation flourished because its two leaders cared more about the mission than about themselves. On a cool autumn evening almost exactly 1 year after the experiment began, Callan invited Maren to the small park overlooking Lake Michigan where she had once sat alone recording every purchase inside her spiral notebook. The trees glowed with shades of gold and crimson, and the calm water reflected the fading sunlight just as it had the afternoon she quietly promised herself that every dollar should improve someone else's tomorrow. They walked slowly along the familiar path before stopping beside the same wooden bench. Maren smiled as she recognized the place. "I have not been here in a long time," she said softly. "Neither have I," Callan replied. "But this seemed like the right place to remember where everything truly began." He reached into a small leather case he had been carrying throughout the evening. Maren assumed it contained another proposal for the foundation, or perhaps plans for a new community project. Instead, Callan carefully lifted out the original spiral notebook, still beautifully preserved inside the handcrafted walnut frame. He held it gently between both hands before looking into her eyes. "A year ago, I believe this notebook recorded expenses," he said quietly. "Now I know it recorded character." Maren felt tears gathering before she even understood where the conversation was leading. Callan continued with a warm smile. "People often say that extraordinary relationships begin with extraordinary moments. I do not think that is true anymore. I think they begin with ordinary choices repeated every single day. You changed my understanding of leadership, generosity, and even success without ever trying to impress me." He slowly knelt on one knee, not holding a velvet jewelry box, but the framed notebook that had changed both of their lives. "The first gift I ever gave you was a black card. The greatest gift you ever gave me was a better way to see the world. Maren Whitlock, will you continue writing the rest of that story with me?" Tears slipped gently down Maren's cheeks as she laughed through her overwhelming emotions. She nodded before she could find the words. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Callan stood, and they embraced beneath the warm autumn sky as the evening breeze carried quiet laughter across the lake. Nearby, the framed notebook rested safely on the park bench, no longer simply a record of receipts, but a reminder that the greatest fortunes are never measured by what we keep for ourselves. They are measured by the lives we choose to change, the kindness we quietly leave behind, and the love that grows when two people discover that true wealth has always begun with the courage to put someone else first. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Chosen by Love. Every like helps us bring more inspiring stories about kindness, integrity, and unforgettable love to people around the world. Share this video with someone who believes true character is worth more than wealth, and join our growing community so you never miss the next emotional journey. Thank you for watching and being part of the Chosen by Love family.